Ladies and gentlemen, I want to invite you into a quiet moment. Not the kind of quiet that comes from peace, but the kind that follows a sharp noise. The kind of silence that descends after a door slams, a voice yells, or a line is crossed. You've felt it, the moment someone disrespects you, deeply, personally, and without apology. And instead of retaliating, you just stop, you don't yell, you don't defend, you go quiet. But something happens in that moment that most people don't understand. Today, I want to explain what that moment actually is neurologically, psychologically, emotionally, and why your silence after the disrespect is killing them, but more importantly, why it's saving you. For the last 20 years, I've studied how human behavior, brain chemistry, and emotional systems collide under stress. We often think the brain is this cold, calculating machine, but in truth, the brain is deeply relational. It's wired for patterns, especially social patterns. When someone disrespects you, what they've really done is violated an unspoken social contract, a contract based on the principle of reciprocity. I treat you with dignity. You treat me with dignity. It's not always conscious, but it governs almost every human relationship. Families, teams, partnerships, strangers. It's why we say thank you to the barista and nod politely at the driver who lets us merge. But disrespect breaks that rhythm, and when it does, the primitive part of the brain, what we call the amygdala, lights up like a firework. Fight or flight. That's the wiring. That's the legacy of being human. Now, most people expect a fight, especially if they're the ones doing the disrespecting. Why? Because people who disrespect others are often looking to reclaim control. They want to provoke, to bait, to push. But when you respond with silence, not the silence of submission, but the silence of presence, you interrupt their entire neurological expectation loop. They were prepared for heat. You gave them stillness. Their brain begins to search, scramble, spin. What just happened? Why didn't that work? Are they angry? Are they planning something? Do they not care? It's an emotional whiplash, and for them it's disorienting. I once worked with a CEO, let's call him James, who was known for being sharp, decisive, brilliant, and brutal. He ran meetings like interrogations, raised voices, sarcasm, belittlement, especially toward people he felt threatened by, which, interestingly enough, were often the most emotionally intelligent people in the room. One day, he took aim at his COO in a board meeting, humiliated him in front of 12 other executives. The room froze, but the COO didn't defend himself. He didn't flinch. He didn't even raise his eyebrows. He closed his notebook, waited, let James finish, and then he said very calmly, "Let me know when you're ready to speak to me professionally. I'll be in my office." He stood up. Walked out, no yelling, no insults, just silence and a boundary. Do you know what happened after? James lost the room, not in a dramatic way, not instantly, but over the next few weeks, people began to respond to him differently. Shorter emails, fewer questions, more silence. Eventually, the board stepped in. James stepped down, not because of that one moment, but because that moment broke the illusion of his power. You see, when you respond with silence to disrespect, you shift the burden. You're no longer defending your dignity. They are left defending their behavior, and that is a very uncomfortable place for a human being to sit. Now, this isn't about revenge. This is about awareness. Our silence speaks when it comes from intention. But silence that comes from fear or internalized shame, well, that's something else entirely. That's silence that hurts us. Let me be clear, I am not advocating for passivity. I'm not asking you to tolerate abuse or avoid necessary conversations. I am asking you to be strategic with your energy, aware of your values, and conscious of your choices. Because when someone disrespects you and you say nothing, not out of fear but out of clarity, you are protecting something vital, your internal integrity, and that matters. We now know that emotional suppression, shoving down what you feel, can trigger the same physical stress pathways as trauma. Cortisol spikes, inflammation rises, the immune system drops, but there's a difference between suppression and regulation. Suppression is pretending nothing happened. Regulation is acknowledging what happened and choosing how to respond. And silence, used wisely, is a form of regulation. You're not ignoring the wound. You're refusing to let it control you. Let's talk about relationships, because this isn't just happening in boardrooms. It's happening at kitchen tables, in text messages, on social media, in childhood bedrooms revisited as adults. A woman I worked with, a doctor, told me a story about her father. Every holiday, he would make subtle but cutting remarks about her career. You work too much, still not married, that's a nice car, must be compensating for something. For years she tried to respond with grace, with logic, even with humor. Nothing changed. Then one year she simply stopped. He made his usual comments, and she didn't bite. She didn't nod. She didn't defend. She just looked at him with a gentle kind of stillness, and then she left early. No anger, just silence and distance. The next year, different tone, no jabs, a softer posture. It wasn't perfect, but the dynamic had shifted, because silence has a way of changing not just what people say, but how they see themselves when they say it. When we don't feed the loop begins to starve. There's something else I want to share, something deeper. People who consistently disrespect others are often deeply disrespected within themselves. That's not an excuse, it's a pattern. In neuroscience, we call this projection, when the brain externalizes inner conflict in order to regulate its own distress. Disrespect is often not about you at all. It's about them trying to manage the chaos inside themselves by creating it outside of themselves. And when you respond with calm silence, you refuse to become part of that chaos. That's powerful. Not only does it protect your peace, it forces them to face what they were trying to escape. Your silence becomes a mirror, and most people are terrified of what they might see in it. I've seen this in marriages, in leadership teams, in politics. I've seen this in families torn apart and brought back together. In students who go quiet in classrooms, in parents who go quiet in front of children. The silence after the disrespect, it's not just emotional, it's biological. It alters the brain state of both people involved. But here's what's crucial, that silence must come from awareness, not resignation. When it does, it becomes a boundary, a signal, a turning point. There's a concept in neuroscience called the prediction error signal. It's what happens when the brain expects one thing and experiences another. It's the mechanism that makes us stop and think, that makes us question our assumptions. When someone disrespects you and expects retaliation, but you offer stillness instead, you trigger a prediction error. Their brain pauses, they feel disoriented, but that pause, that's where new thinking can begin. You've just opened a door, and that door leads to reflection, sometimes even remorse. We underestimate the power of what we don't say. But neuroscience, behavioral psychology, even immunology, they all confirm silence is not empty. It is information, and it has weight, especially when it follows pain, especially when it's not meant to punish, but to protect, especially when it's not withdrawal, but wisdom. Silence after the disrespect is a message that says, I will not invite you to disrespect me again. It says, my value doesn't require your recognition. It says, you don't get to decide who I am. And for the person who crossed the line, that message is not just confusing, it's confronting, because they now have to sit, not with your retaliation, but with themselves. And for many people, that's far more unbearable, and this is why, ladies and gentlemen, so many people begin to unravel not during the argument, but after it, when the silence settles in, and they're left alone with the echo of their own behavior. You see, we live in a society that praises quick wit, sharp comebacks, clever insults. We treat verbal sparring like a sport. Social media has only amplified this. A public clapback is now seen as a badge of honor. But here's the problem: when we react immediately, when we fight disrespect with more noise, we might win the moment, but we lose the long game. We become entangled in someone else's chaos. We surrender our peace to win their approval or dominance. What's far more difficult and far more meaningful is to not react from the wound, but to respond from the wisdom. That's what silence allows, and it's not passive, it's not lazy, it's discipline, it's strategy. And most importantly, it's healing. Let me tell you about a young man I worked with, Michael. He grew up in a household where disrespect was the language of love, criticism, comparison, coldness. His father never once told him he was proud, never once said, I love you. But he constantly told him what he was not smart enough, not strong enough, not like his brother. Michael internalized this. He became wildly successful, but deeply unsettled. He'd go into meetings ready for battle, expecting disrespect in every glance, interpreting silence as judgment. He lived on edge, his nervous system conditioned to brace for attack. Then one day, during a session, I asked him, "What would happen if you stopped trying to win against your father's voice? What if you let the silence speak for itself?" It took him months, but eventually he went home for a visit. His father, as usual, made a remarksome jab about how Michael was too soft now, too emotionally fragile. Michael didn't react, didn't explain himself. He smiled, looked at his father calmly, and said, "That's an old story. I don't live in it anymore." And he left it at that. That silence, after decades of trying to prove himself, was seismic, and the result, a few weeks later, his father called him for the first time in years just to talk. No agenda, no critique, just presence. Now, did his father transform overnight? No, but the cycle had been disrupted, a seed had been planted, and more importantly, Michael had healed a part of himself that no argument could ever reach. This is what I want you to understand when we respond with silence, not from fear, but from strength. We stop fighting the old story. We stop rehearsing pain and start writing something new. And when someone disrespects you, the most radical thing you can do is not participate in their story. Because silence doesn't just withhold words, it withholds permission. Let's look at the science again. The vagus nerve, one of the most important nerves in the body, governs your parasympathetic nervous system, your ability to rest, digest, and self-regulate. When you're disrespected, your body often enters sympathetic overdrive, heart racing, breathing shallow, fists clenching. But when you consciously pause, when you choose silence over retaliation, something beautiful happens. You signal to your body, "I am not in danger, I am in control." You self-soothe, you activate higher cognitive functions, logic, empathy, vision, leadership. That's when clarity returns. That's when you remember your values. And that's when your silence becomes not just a boundary, but a strategy for resilience. In fact, some of the most powerful leaders I've ever studied have one thing in common. They are slow to anger, quick to listen, and deliberate with silence. Not because they're afraid of conflict, but because they understand something that we forget too easily. Not everything needs to be answered in real time. Sometimes the most powerful leadership happens in the pause. Think about the last time someone truly disrespected you. Really sit with it. Not just the offense, but your response. What did it cost you to react? What might you have gained if you hadn't? Now imagine this the next time it happens, and it will. You feel the surge, the fire, the instinct to defend yourself, but you don't, you breathe, you say nothing, or you say something small, grounded, measured, clear, and then you let them sit with it. No defense, no justification, just space. That space becomes a mirror. That mirror becomes a moment, and that moment, that's where growth either begins or gets avoided again. But it's not your job to make them grow. It's your job to choose yourself. I want to touch on one more point before we close, because this is where it gets personal for many people. What do you do when the person disrespecting you is someone you love? A parent, a partner, a sibling, a friend. This is the hardest kind of silence. The silence that doesn't come from anger but from heartbreak. And this is where the misunderstanding often creeps in. People will say, "But if I go silent, won't they think I don't care? If I don't defend myself, won't they just keep hurting me? If I don't explain, how will they ever know what they've done?" Here's the truth. Silence is not a lack of love. It is often the deepest expression of it. Because sometimes the most loving thing you can do is step back, to let someone feel the consequences of their actions without shielding them from it. That is what emotional adulthood looks like. We don't punish. We don't ghost, we don't manipulate with silence, we clarify with it. We clarify our values, our limits, our identity, our capacity, and in that clarity, the people who are meant to remain will find their way toward you again, with humility, with responsibility, with growth. The ones who don't, that's not your loss, that's your liberation. There is a kind of quiet that can heal the nervous system. There is a kind of silence that repairs the soul, but only when it's rooted in self-worth. Not in fear. Only when it's chosen, not defaulted to, and when you carry that kind of silence into the world, not as a weapon, but as a wisdom. People feel it. They may not understand it, but they feel it. And those who once disrespected you, They feel it the most, because when they go to provoke the chaos again, and it doesn't come, they meet themselves instead. And for many, that is the most uncomfortable conversation they've ever had. So the next time someone disrespects you, and the fire starts to rise, and your heart races, and you want to make them feel the pain they gave you, pause. Pause not because you're weak, pause because you're free. You don't owe them a reaction. You owe yourself a decision. And if that decision is silence, let it be the kind of silence that speaks louder than any scream ever could. Let it be the silence that changes the room. Let it be the silence that rewrites the story, not just for them, but for you. Because your silence after the disrespect, it's not killing your power, it's proving it. Thank you.